Okay, so Lavos Prime access has just dropped, and I can't lie to you, I think this is one of the best Prime accesses that we have ever had. If we look at consistency across the board, it not only has an excellent accessories pack with one of the best sets of armor and a really solid signed arm to go with it, but come on man, the selection of the Cedo Prime, the Jules Zorin, which is an amazing throwback, and Lavos, who looks absolutely incredible. It was taking a lot out of me to try to hold my wallet and not buy the access because, you know, it's pretty expensive and I wanted to get everything, so I just figured I'd farm up Lavos, and that's who we're going to be reviewing today. In my opinion, Lavos is one of the most satisfying frames in the game, and that's probably due to him being a status oriented Warframe. Usually frames that have access to pretty much every element in the game are guaranteed to be extremely useful across the board, but Lavos has yet to hit mainstream across Warframe. I know Kome has the Warframe community split on whether people think she's good or bad, but in my opinion, I think Lavos kind of fits that same narrative, at least of what I've seen. A lot of people think Lavos is S tier and really strong and very underrated, whilst others think he could do with some improvements. Me personally, after playing him a bit more, I think he is one of my favourite comfort pick frames in the game right now. I was put onto this concept a bit more by the Kengineer, who is of course a Lavos main or someone who uses this frame as a comfort pick on a regular occasion. Although admittedly I like using Lavos a bit more surrounding his ult because I think the room nuking potential on him is incredibly fun, satisfying, and offers a different playstyle to that of frames that can just insta nuke rooms with not a lot of setup. Today I wanted to cover his abilities real quick, also go over the nice synergies that he has with weapons, elements, and of course with Sentinel, which you're going to be seeing a lot of incredible room nuking in the gameplay in the background when we're combining the elements from our Sentinel and all of Lavos' priming. Of course, Lavos is a little bit of a complex Warframe, which makes him rather unique and more interesting overall, even outside of his satisfying status effects. His passive allows him to gain status immunity from universal and energy orbs. Now, as far as I'm aware, this also counts towards immunity from knockdowns, although I could be incorrect on this, but from gameplay, as you can see I was leveling up my Lavos Prime, I didn't have Prime Sure-Footed equipped and I don't recall getting knocked down, so I think this does apply, but don't quote me on that because I have seen, you know, Lavos mains such as the Kengineer using Prime Sure-Footed on him. Anywho, his other passive is far more important, and that is that he can hold down any of his abilities to imbue an element into his next ability cast. And it's not just a singular element, you can combine elements, giving you access to almost every element in the game except, you know, exclusive ones such as Void or Tau. On its own, this function is more useful when combined with his fourth ability, which we'll get into, but there is also an augment that makes him incredibly powerful when combining with this passive. As for his first ability, Ophidian Bite, it is a simple single cast lash with his serpents, hitting quite a few enemies that are close to you, healing you and doing toxin damage. And the correlation is that the base toxin damage is also what this ability will give you when you hold it down, granting you toxin on your next ability cast. And as stated earlier, Lavos functions via cooldowns as opposed to energy, so this ability has an 8-second cooldown. Ophidian Bite also has an extremely useful augment which we'll be using today, which is called Swift Bite. This is incredibly useful because it will give you bonus range and give you a cooldown reduction of 4 seconds. This ability may seem a bit basic and gimmicky at first, but actually I think it is a core part of his kit, especially as this is probably the best candidate to use with Archon continuity, considering you can just tap it without even imbuing it and it will do base toxin, and then with Archon continuity it will do corrosive at the same time. His next ability is a long range duration based dash called Vial Rush. You'll dash forward and leave ice vials everywhere behind you, and these will of course freeze enemies with cold damage. Being that cold is a spaced element, you hold it down to grant yourself cold on your next ability cast. It has a cooldown of 5 seconds. The explosion radius of all those ice vials you drop is affected by power range, and then the overall distance coverage of the dash is affected by your power duration. Not only does this proc a lot of cold on enemies, freezing them, slowing them down, but it's also one of the best mobility tools in game and makes Lavos incredibly fast. His third ability is Transmutation Probe. You'll launch out a probe that converts both energy and health orbs into universal orbs, and the same thing goes for ammo pickups as well, as they will give you ammo for every weapon, and this of course synergizes really nicely with its passive for that stats immunity. It will shock enemies with electricity damage, meaning that when you imbue or hold it down, it will give you electric damage on your next ability cast, and every enemy it strikes, it will reduce your cooldowns by 1.5 seconds across all of your abilities. So this is an important part of his kit because not only does it provide a large amount of crowd control, also synergizes with his passive and supports his team, but also electricity is an incredibly important element when you want to combine it with something like Toxin for corrosive and reducing those cooldowns, allowing you to spam your abilities more. A nice little gimmick you can do with this is casting it just before you cast your second ability, Vile Rush. You throw it down a corridor, the probe is going to slowly move forward, hitting enemies, reducing the cooldowns of your abilities. But if you immediately start dashing through them, by the time your dash ends and you're on the other end of the corridor, your cooldown will already have been reset by this ability, allowing you to dash again and traverse even further. And finally, his fourth ability, Catalyze. Catalyze probes will send out in a circular formation and do a base fire damage to any enemy they hit. Hold this ability down to imbue your next ability cast with, of course, fire damage. Sounds like a basic nuke at first until you realise that the damage is doubled for this ability for every element afflicted on the enemy. So yeah, if you prime the ever-living shit out of a horde of enemies via either your abilities or your weapons and then cast this, you can hit some ridiculous numbers. Unfortunately, it has a 30-second cooldown, and you're also going to want to pump it full of a bit of range to make it actually useful. But generally the gameplay loop is of course to prime a bunch of enemies first and get some AoE status procs going, and then use this on enemies that are primed, and then of course cast either Ophidian Bite with its augment for a lesser cooldown of 4 seconds, and of course throw out your probe to reduce that cooldown even further. Where Lavos gets complex is in his gameplay loop, as honestly, even when I don't play this Warframe for an extended period of time, I find trouble in remembering what elements I'm supposed to be clicking on my abilities in what order in order to get the most amount of damage out of my fourth. In addition to this, I also don't like subsuming off any of his abilities because they all grant me a specific element that I can use either as a base imbued element on my abilities, but also as a combination for all of those other elements. So finding one to get rid of is actually kind of frustrating, albeit there are options, and I think the best option is if you want to go for a more gun run loadout, you could remove his fourth ability to avoid the nuke altogether and just purely focus on gaining your main elements on your weapons. That's right, you can also gain all of these imbued elements on your weapons via the augment Valence formation. This is an augment based on your passive where casting an ability imbued with extra elemental damage from that passive will apply that bonus element to your weapons, and this goes for every base element in the game because he has access to all of them. This opens up all of your weaponry to insane elemental combinations. It's also worth noting that recently we did receive the change where any elemental damage bonus from augments such as this augment or, for example, Volt's Shock Trooper, those elements will be separate to the elements on your weapons. So for example, if I have just the heat element on my primary weapon and I was to cast an electric imbued ability from Lavos, that bonus electric damage from Valence formation will not apply to the heat damage and combine with it on my primary, as whereas previously this will combine for radiation, but now your weapon will be dealing both that heat and the electricity separately. This change also benefits his four because it means now instead of having those two elements combine into one element, you would now be proccing two. Lavos is also unique in the fact that his gameplay loop and the way you decide to play him and the order in which you cast your abilities depends on how you mod your weapons. Unfortunately, don't have the Pseudo Prime at the moment of recording this video. My luck hasn't been too great with the relics on that front. However, I am still using the regular Pseudo in the footage. If you're unaware, the Pseudo is Lavos' signature weapon with an alt fire that sends out a glaive with guaranteed status chance, proccing all enemies with status, and this acts as a built-in condition overload for the Pseudo. This is an incredible primer for Lavos as the range of this alt fire is actually quite big, and we've got a new mods recently which allow us to mod it for more elements than we normally would have, and in my instance I mod it for radiation, corrosive, heat and magnetic. I'm getting radiation from atomic fallout and magnetic from magnetic strafe. So if I send out this alt fire, I already have multiple elements hitting enemies, thus contributing to damage on my fourth ability. But what I can also do before I use this alt fire is imbue the Pseudo with another element, such as something really useful like viral. Simply put, I would hold down my first and second ability to get that toxin and cold combination, and then cast whatever ability I want to next, and it will imbue my weapon with viral. I can then proc cold or whatever other element I want. I could imbue my dash with blast. I can imbue my abilities with gas. Pretty much any element that currently hasn't applied on them I can acquire. I can stun them with electricity. And finally, with the catalyze, the two elements I usually enjoy imbuing it with before it's cast is either fire or blast. Not only does Catalyze nuke pretty much everything the game's going to throw at you, but if you have any condition overload mods on your weapons, the priming playstyle of Lavos is going to guarantee that everything gets eviscerated. Lavos' entire playstyle is just based around having every status proc available at all times and multiplying your damage based off of this. So on average, my gameplay loop is holding down my first and second ability to imbue my next primary attack with Viral. Usually I'll just cast my first ability with this, dashing down a corridor with Viral Rush to proc enemies with cold, slow them down, freeze them, and synergize with an arcane that we're going to be using. Send his probe the opposite direction back down the corridor to reduce my cooldowns. Sometimes I may imbue this with blast or gas. Make sure I get an alt fire off with my Cedo, imbue my Catalyze with fire, and then cast it, and everything in the room is going to die. And then from there you just want to cast your 1 and your 3 and your 2 again, of course reducing your cooldown with your probe, and if you're using the augment for his lash, you'll also reduce your cooldowns further. As for how we're building him, I first want to go over my arcane choices. As you can see on the build, I'm not really using any power strength, so in my arcanes I'm compensating with Molt Augmented and Arcane Ice Storm. Arcane Ice Storm is not only going to give us bonus strength but also ability duration when enemies are frozen, which is going to occur often from our second Viral Rush. This will freeze enemies, and that bonus duration is going to combine nicely with not only the duration of Viral Rush itself, allowing us to dash way further, but also the duration on the buff from our first ability Ophidian Bite and its augment Valence Formation. Well, Valence Formation is for the passive, but in terms of how I usually apply the buff, I like using the first ability because it's quick. You can use any of the abilities to apply Valence Formation to your weapon. Swift Bite is also in here to provide me with even further cooldowns. This is a bit of a band-aid mod, which does annoy me because I wish this ability would reduce cooldowns by 4 seconds at base, but the bonus range is also nice here. As stated earlier, we really want range, mainly for the 4th ability. Augur Reach and Stretch help here, and you don't need Arc on Stretch because Lavos doesn't use energy. Talon Drift in the Aura, like I stated earlier, I'm like 99% sure his passive does prevent knockdowns, at least from my gameplay experience. I don't know whether I'm tripping balls, but I just throw Cunning Drift in here and it gets the job done. A little bit more range doesn't hurt. Corrosive Projection is optional, but I like having it in here to reduce enemies' armor. It goes nicely with his overall kit. Growing Power would be a really good alternative. Adaptation and Umbral Fiber for a large amount of damage reduction and armor, and an Archon Vitality instead of Umbral because we can double our heat procs whenever we're using it primarily with Catalyze, just doubling our overall damage. And then finally, as of course stated earlier, Archon Continuity, so we can proc Corrosive whenever we proc Toxin with our abilities. I mostly just use this when casting Ophidian Bite because I don't imbue Toxin on a lot of my ability casts, but you can also do it with any other ability. It's very flexible. Something else that can also determine what elements you imbue on your abilities and weapons is of course your Sentinel and its weapon. My Sentinel is using the Lavos Prime, using Viral and Heat, meaning those two elements don't really need to be imbued on any of our weapons if you want to add the element multiplier onto Catalyze. You could have your primary doing, like we stated earlier, radiation, heat, corrosive, magnetic. Then my Sentinel is going to be proccing everything with heat and viral, so I could just throw on gas on my weapons, blast, as many different elements as I want. I will be honest, I do feel like the Nautilus is almost a must-have because Lavos' range on Catalyze isn't as much as I'd hope, and just grouping enemies helps him make use of all of his status application overall, so the grouping of the Nautilus is perfect for him. Due to the fact I don't have his new Jewel Zoran, I figured it'd be nice to substitute it, at least with something that makes sense with him, which is the Jewel Ica Incarnon. With the Incarnon form, you can proc huge gas clouds whenever you kill enemies. These will linger for a few seconds and proc melee influence and all of the elements you have on it. It is worth noting that the clouds that the Jewel Ica procs actually make really good use of Bane mods. Me personally, I can't stand using Bane mods because they're always so specific and you have to constantly take them on and off depending on which faction you're fighting, so they're not in my build, but if you would like to achieve the maximum amount of damage, I'd recommend combining a Bane mod with something like Prime Pressure Point. In my case, I've just gone for a bunch of status and a nice combination, making use of Magnetic Rush, building this thing for gas, and of course we're using Influence with Voltaic Strike. As for focus schools, I was using Madara in the gameplay as I really like the casting speed and the strength bonus for more overall damage, but in addition to this we got to talk Archon Shards real quick. I'm probably going to throw my old Lavos into the helmet and take off my 2 Amber Archon Shards for casting speed and put them on my Lavos Prime because he is quite a caster heavy Warframe and he could really use the casting speed, much like pretty much every frame in the game right now. Those are the shards that we'll be using, as they're overall going to increase your DPS. And that about sums it up for everything I have to cover of the new Lavos Prime. Let me know whether you guys like Lavos' Prime design. I think he's one of the best looking frames we've got in the game, and I'm not surprised I enjoy him so much considering how similar he is to Kome. If you're looking for a really satisfying Warframe who's also a good comfort pick and honestly slept on in terms of not only really good nuking but a weapons platform as well, I highly recommend you check out Lavos. Hope you guys enjoyed. If so, feel free to like and subscribe. If not, then no worries. All my links will be in the description if you're interested, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.